This video will help you better understand how to write measurable, observable learning objectives, specifically using Bloom's taxonomy in conjunction with the PA Early Learning Standards. We're also going to discuss how formal and summative assessment strategies should be connected to the learning objectives. So why do these objectives matter? If you don't know where you're going, any road will get you there. Clear objectives tell children, families, and teachers exactly what success looks like. So there's a common saying that if failure to plan is planning to fail. So this is the foundation of intentional, equitable teaching. So for the teacher, it helps to focus instruction on a specific accessible outcome. Guides selection of materials and teaching strategies, makes planning intentional, not accidental, and it ensures alignment between the objective, the instruction, and the assessment. How do objectives help the child? It'll tell the child exactly what success looks like. It builds incremental mastery and confidence. So think of it as little steps towards success. You're going to break down the larger goal of learning how to read. How are we going to do that day in and day out? And how will we know if it's working? Also, clear and measurable objectives reduce guesswork and anxiety for students. But how about for families and programs, the other stakeholders in this equation? So for families and programs, it provides transparent, communicable evidence of learning. It supports the PA Early Learning Standards and NAEYC documentation requirements. It drives data-informed instructional decisions and demonstrates program quality and accountability. The anatomy of a learning objective. So this is a pretty simple graphic organizer of how to think about writing an objective, A, B, C, D. So the A stands for audience, who is learning. And sometimes I teach it as TWASBOT, the student will be able to. So the who is the learning, it can be the child, the student, however you want to phrase it. The behavior is what observable action will the child do to demonstrate that they've learned. So when you see the behavior here, it's not like a classroom management behavior, like the child will, share or be patient or take turns. You're going to go directly to Bloom's taxonomy and select a measurable verb that will indicate what the child should be able to do at the end of the lesson. So some things that we can see is the child will sort. I can observe that. I can watch the child sorting. I can also measure. Have they sorted things correctly, right? So that is measurable, that's observable. The child will explain. Again, I can measure their explanation, whether they're telling it to me verbally or whether they're writing it down. I have the ability to look or listen to their explanation to determine if it has met the acceptable outcome. And will construct. So again, I can observe that. I can measure that. So that's an example of observable actions. The C is under what circumstances. So this is the condition. So the child is going to sort, but what are they going to sort? How are they going to sort? The child is going to explain, but what are they going to explain? How are they going to explain? So for example, you might say the student will sort picture cards into two groups based on initial phoneme sounds. So that would be the condition. They're going to separate picture cards into two groups, some that might start with the sound and some might start with the t sound. Or if you want it to be a little bit more challenging, pick similar sounds. One might start with the sound and one might start with a N sound, and that would require a higher level of auditory discrimination in order to sort the cards. So what are they going to use? Are they going to have manipulatives? Are they going to listen to a story and then do an activity, right? The condition doesn't have to be complicated. It's just what you're imagining happening in the lesson plan. And lastly, the degree is going to be how well or how many. So let me tell you what we don't want to do here. We don't want to say 80% of the students are going to sort picture cards into two initial phonemes groups. Because if I say that, if I'm saying right at the beginning, 80% of students will be able to, then I'm already automatically discounting 20%. I know 20% of my class is not going to do this. So we don't want to think in those terms. And that used to be a long time ago. That was the way objectives were written because, hey, 80% sounds great, right? The majority of my class is getting this. But one of the things that No Child Left Behind has brought to the surface is that we don't want to leave those 20% behind, right? That's not appropriate. That's not ethical. So instead, you can say something, the student will sort manipulatives into color groups with 80% accuracy. So that means we're looking at the student and we're saying every student has the benchmark of 80% accuracy. That's what's acceptable. So if somebody sorts them all correctly, wonderful. We'll make note of that. If a child sorts with only 50% accuracy, they did not meet the objective. So therefore, they're going to require some extra practice, or the teacher's going to reflect on what are the reasons that the child did not meet the target. So you could also say things, the child will explain using at least 3 examples of why chocolate ice cream is their favorite, right? So if the child uses 3 examples to tell me why chocolate ice cream is their favorite, great, they've met my objective. If a child only uses 2 examples or 1 example, or there's not a clear example, they need some additional practice with this specific skill. If a child can go through and write a whole dissertation about why they love chocolate, good for them, right? They could use maybe some challenging materials. So the example down here is the child, that's the audience, will sort, that's the behavior, given a set of 10 picture cards into 2 categories, that being needs and wants, with 80% accuracy. So I can observe that, I can watch them sort into 2 categories, and then I can measure that sorting. Did they get it correct? Are they getting 80% accuracy? So Bloom's taxonomy. This might be new to you, it might be a refresher, depending on where you are in your curriculum at LCCC. So really what Bloom's taxonomy is, Benjamin Bloom was a researcher in the 1960s who really focused on, is considered the father of modern special education. He and his team, I can't imagine he did it by himself, he and his team looked at cognitive demand. So they started at the bottom, which is the base, and that will represent the type of thinking that is the least cognitively demanding. So in other words, it's fairly easy to remember, and it can be more difficult or time-taking to create something. So as we move up, the cognitive demand gets stronger, and then the work and the expectations and the support that students get is going to differ. So we start at the bottom, and we remember. Once we remember, then we can understand. Once we understand, then we can apply. Once we apply, Then we can analyze. So analyze means taking a whole thing and breaking it apart, looking at it into smaller parts. What makes a good lesson plan, for example, right? You would first have to remember what the components of an effective lesson plan are. You'd have to understand those components, how they work together. You would have to be able to apply some of those concepts of lesson planning, like understanding objectives and meeting a standard and meeting an assessment, before I could give you a lesson plan and say, okay, now tell me, evaluate this, I'm sorry, analyze this. What are the pieces and how do they work together? The next step would be to evaluate. So that's when I would give you a lesson plan. And then I would say, okay, tell me, based on everything you know, so look at everything you're able to do, is this a good lesson plan? Does it meet the requirements? That's challenging, right? That takes a lot of practice. That doesn't happen in just one day or just one lesson. It takes some time to build. It takes a skillful teacher to know, well, first we start with remembering and then we move up. Lastly, the most demanding cognitive skill is to create. So this is where you would write your own lesson plan, right? So I can't ask you to write a lesson plan if you don't understand, if you've never had any chance to practice with that lesson plan. So lucky for us that there's certain verbs. There's measurable and observable actions that have already been categorized into the levels of cognitive demand. So if we look down here at the remember, if you ask the student to identify something, name, list, recall, define, you're asking very low-level questions. That doesn't mean it's not important, and it doesn't mean it should happen quickly, or it's only for very young children. Everybody needs a chance to remember when they're learning something new. It's getting into individual learner differences. That's going to depend on how well we remember, how quickly we remember, that sort of thing. And then you can see that there's verbs for understand, that there's verbs for applying, there's verbs for analyzing, there's verbs for evaluating. So this is grading, right? All the teachers. So when we have to grade lesson plans, when we have to grade presentations, when we have to grade projects, right? We're operating at a higher cognitive demand. And then lastly, create, where a child or a learner will design, produce, plan, compose, or develop something. So these are not the only verbs associated to each level of Bloom's taxonomy. There's plenty of resources that are online. Simply Google Bloom's taxonomy. You will get a variety. So you will need to know these, particularly if you're moving on to a 4-year degree and you're expecting to take your PAPA exams to become a certified teacher. There will be questions on your PAPA exams specifically about, or your PECT exams, I'm sorry, your PECT exams about the pyramid. So a student has made a mnemonic device to help us remember. So it's reach up and always eat Cheerios. So if you could remember, reach up and always eat Cheerios, you're going to remember that level in order. So writing the objectives, step-by-step formula. So number 1, you start with the early learning standard. So you're going to identify the domain and the indicator. So the child uses comprehension skills while listening to or reading text. So that's the standard. So that's meant to be at the end of this grade, at the end of this time, the child is going to be able to demonstrate their comprehension skills. Okay, so that's a great goal to have. But I can't just go in and with that being my objective, I have to break it down into manageable steps. So now I'm going to choose a Bloom's level appropriate to the age and or their prior learning. So for beginners, I'm going to use remember or understand. If there's somebody that is already kind of familiar with comprehension, they've been listening to stories for a little bit longer, they're able to articulate responses to questions, they might move on to apply or analyze. And then as the children get better with this skill, so almost think of it in kindergarten, right? If we're all beginners in September, right, we can move up to the advanced by the end of the school year, where they're evaluating or creating comprehension skills based on a text. So after we have the standard, we will pick a spot on verb or a spot on Bloom where we want to work. Then you have to pick your specific verb. So the verb has to be observable so you can see or hear the behavior. So explain is great, sort is great, construct is great. These are 3 stinky verbs, right? I call them stinky verbs because they don't help us. So if you say something like the student will be able to understand the difference between vowels and consonants, right? You might say, Zelinsky, that's a great idea. Why wouldn't I want a student to understand the difference? That's a great goal, but it's not a measurable objective. How will you know if they're able to differentiate between a vowel and a consonant? There's nothing measurable. You've stated nothing observable. Understanding is an internal cognitive task. It happens inside someone's head. I can't see that. So I have to think of a verb that the child could do to show me that they understand. To know is something similar. The students will know how to count to 10. Again, great goal, right? I would love all my students to be able to count to 10. But how will you know that they know? You have to give something measurable and something observable. Learn is also an example of a poor choice. It is not measurable and it is not observable. The students will learn how to write their name. Okay, great. How? How are they going to write their name? How will you know that they can write their name? So we want to make sure that we're just being as specific as we can because that helps us stay on target. And the last one is appreciate. The students will appreciate the reasons why we recycle. You know, okay, great. I want my students to understand that recycling helps the environment. We want to make sure that we're taking care of the planet and taking care of our community. But how will I know that they've appreciated this? What does that mean? You have to go back to Bloom and pick a verb. Then we think about the content, the condition, and the degree. So what they act on is the content, how would be the condition, and how well is the degree. So the student will be able to explain the problem in the story using 2 details from the text. Now all of a sudden I know exactly what this lesson plan is going to look like. They're going to listen to a story or read a story. They're going to explain the problem, and they're going to use at least 2 details from the text. Great. So is it observable? Is it measurable? Is it child achievable? So again, back to that 80% of my kids are going to be able to do that. We don't want to think like that, assuming 20% are not going to be able to do that. So can I watch the child do this? Can I count or score it? Is it realistic for this age group and stage or this particular child? So going back to number 4, explain the problem in the story using 2 details. This is what we want all our students to be able to do. But how they do the explaining, that's where we can differentiate. Maybe some students will write. Maybe some students will draw. Maybe some students will tell, verbally what the problem is. Maybe some students will use the book as a prompter to go back and remember the details. Other students might do it from memory. You might have sentence starters. You might have some of the problems and the details of the story written on sentence strips, and then the child can pick those to create their explanation. Another child might not need that level of scaffolding or that level of support. So this is where we start thinking about, this is what I want to happen. I have to have that first before I can decide how am I going to get all of my children a chance to achieve this learning objective. So measurable and not measurable. You can take a minute and read down each side. So for example, the child will appreciate different cultures. I don't know how to measure that. What does that look like? How about the child will explain one similarity and one difference between two family traditions pictured? Ah, there we go. So that's a way they can tell me that they're appreciating different cultures. They're explaining some differences or similarities that they see. I understand, there's a common reason people celebrate. The way that celebration looks can be different from culture to culture, from family to family. Now I get it. If you cannot watch a child do it and count it or score it, rewrite it. So the next part of our objective writing is assessment. How will we know that they're able to explain differences in a story, or they're going to be able to write their name? How will we know? So there's two general types of assessment. There's formal and formative, which happens all the time, every day, constantly. It's one of the reasons why teachers are tired, right? Because we're constantly doing this. And then there's summative, which is more of the pinnacle. So think about, like, when I think of the word summative, I think of like the summit of a mountain, the very top, like you've climbed the mountain at the top there. We're going to see what we know. So formal is ongoing in the moment data gathered during instruction to guide teaching. So this is where you're watching your students, you're listening to them explain, you're watching them work, either independently or in groups. You're listening to the vocabulary that they're using, you're listening to how they're describing concepts, and then you can decide who is understanding it in the moment and who isn't. So if you're picking up that a lot of your students are on the right track, that they're really getting this idea, you can confidently move the lesson forward. If you're hearing a lot of mistakes, or you're hearing a lot of inaccuracies or off-task behavior, right, we're not going to plow through. We're going to stop and address those needs in the moment, right then and right there. So what are some of the things that we can do? We can take anecdotal notes and running records. We can do checklists. I like to do things like questioning during the activity. So anytime a teacher asks a student a question, that's a type of assessment. It's a formative assessment. So you can do the turn and talk. I call that think, pair, share, or the think alouds. Work samples collected over time. So how did the child write their name in September? How did the child write their name in January? And how did the child write their name in May, right? That helps me see how the child's skills are progressing. I can also use developmental screening tools like ages and stages, and exit slips, which might be something you're familiar with from your days as a student, where you have to answer a question or pose a question based on that lesson. The end of unit or the end of period evidence of whether the objective was reached, that's going to be our summative assessment. So for example, your early childhood education portfolios that you created in ECE 100, that's our summative assessment of our whole program, right? How well did you meet the program requirements? You can do teacher-led individual assessment conference. So think like to your practicums, right? You're going to be doing a mock family teacher conference in practicum 1, and then in practicum 2, you're going to discuss your play-based unit. So there's going to be a lot of conversation going on to make sure that you really understand what's happening. Documentation panels and pre and post checklist comparison. So almost think of like a pre-quiz and a post-quiz, or a pre-test and a post-test. Those can be an example of summative assessments. So questioning as assessment. So this is the most powerful tool that a teacher can use to determine if students are picking up what the teacher is putting down. And it's also very important in our new online learning and hybrid learning that students keep their cameras on, right? It's not so much that, when I ask students to keep their cameras on during a virtual class, it's not so much that I can see that you're sitting right in front of your camera and you're fully engaged and, you're not distracted. All of those things are important, but that's like policing work. That's babysitting work. That's not my goal. My goal is so that I can watch facial expressions, right? So that you're much more I could tell if something that I said has confused someone, or if somebody has a question. Sometimes I can just, you can look at a student and say, what do you want to ask? I know you're thinking about something. What is it? So when everybody's sitting with their cameras off, I lose that piece of assessment data, and it doesn't make for an effective learning environment. Okay, so for questioning, and again, you might remember on our lesson plan template that you're supposed to ask 5 questions that you could ask while you're teaching this lesson. So you can come back to Bloom's taxonomy. So again, this is a beginning starting point. There's lots of resources. Some I'll put in our class, some you can find on your own. Some you can just ask. You don't need to always go back to Bloom and start with one of Bloom's, question starters. It can be a question that you want the child to have answered. That's perfectly fine. So if you want to know if a child has remembered something, you can say, what is this called? Hold up a picture of a square. What is this called? What shape is this? That's remembering. Show me how you would make 2 triangles out of this square. Right? So now a student is applying some of their knowledge about shapes. Understand. Tell me what happened in your own words. Analyze. Why did you put this in here? Right? Why did you decide to put your block tower? Why did you decide to create this structure right in the middle of your block tower? You're getting them to think about their reasoning. So pro tip, write 2 to 3 questions per Bloom's at level before teaching. This keeps assessment intentional and not improvisational. So that means, and again, like I've said this before, if you've been in my lesson planning classes, that those questions that you create in your lesson plan template, you can ask them. You probably will ask them, but you don't have to ask them in that order. And you can certainly change gears as you're interacting with your students. So if you're seeing that students are really understanding the material, you might skip some of those remembering questions and move on to some application or analysis. If your goal was to have them apply and analyze, but they're having difficulty remembering and understanding, right, then you hang out in that area of the skills. So level 1. So the approaches to learning. So this is for our Pennsylvania Early Learning Standard, AL1. So here's an example. The child will name at least 3 classroom materials used during morning choice time. So again, this might not be something that you're going to write out a formal lesson plan for, but we know in Pennsylvania that we need to make sure that we're providing students opportunities to approach their learning. So what does that look like? So that looks like teachers being familiar. That's those yellow colored standards in the early learning standards. How can I create opportunities for children to understand this concept? So for formative assessment, I could have a checklist created. Teacher calls object by name, child points and says name. I think that's a little pedantic. I would much rather see something more, more contextual to the child, like more naturalistic. There's the word I'm looking for. So as the child is going through their morning choice time, asking them about the things that they're using rather than turning it into a quiz, but that's just a philosophical approach that would be different. An exit slip can draw or point to 3 materials scored with the 3-point checklist. And questions that you can ask to see if they can name 3 classroom materials used during morning choice time is, what is this called? Can you find the calendar? Tell me the names of the things you used today. For understanding, let's look at language and literacy, comprehension. So here the learning objective could be the child will explain in their own words what the main character wanted in the story. So how can I assess that? I could do a running record. I can write down what the child says. I can do an anecdotal note during the book discussion, write down, again, a much briefer response to what the child states. A summative assessment would be at the end. Maybe I start reading this story on Monday, and then by, we read it Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and then by Friday, the children are very familiar with this. Now we're going to do a retell rubric, right? That might be a little bit more in depth and a little bit more high level rather than the day-to-day learning objectives. Okay. For application, let's look at math. So operations and algebraic thinking. A learning objective could be the child will use counting on strategy to solve addition problems within 10 using manipulatives. So I set a lot of limits in that objective. I know we're going to use the counting on strategy. So in other words, if I know that I have 5 of something, then if I have one more, it's going to be 6. Like I don't have to start all the way at the beginning. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. I can just start at 5 and say 6, 7, 8 if I've got 3 extra. And then I'm limiting them to 10, right? So I'm not expecting the students to have counting skills or number quantities beyond 10 at this time. So I can do an observation checklist when they're working at the math center. I can have a performance task like solve 5 addition cards, and the teacher can record the strategies that are used. This is everything that I can see to tell, can they count on up to 10? For analyzing, let's look at social studies, community and culture. The child will distinguish between needs and wants by sorting picture cards into 2 categories. This is a need. I have water, food, clothing. This is a want, Xbox, a PlayStation, things like that, something that the kids can really relate to. Again, how will I know if they can distinguish this? I can do anecdotal observation, sort where the child will sort and verbally explain, and then I can just take quick notes. How efficient and how correct was their explanation? Did they seem to really just zip right through it? Did they need a little bit of instructional scaffolding, a little bit of instructional support? So that's where you might come in with some of these questions. Why did you put this here? How is this different from a need or a want? They needed some of that guidance. Or is a child not answering any of the questions correctly? Then that could be an indicator that this activity is simply too challenging for this child, either with their skill set or just on this particular day, and that child will need to go back and have some additional practice. The 5th level is evaluate. So let's look at social and emotional learning, particularly relationships. The child will recommend a fair solution to a peer conflict and justify their reasoning. Right? So the teacher observation during a conflict resolution, I can record on a social and emotional learning checklist. Summative assessment, I can have a scenario card, a partner discussion, a rubric. We could talk about the solution offered, the reason given, the peers that are considered. So if you can see the big difference here in the formal and formative assessment, this is what's happening while you're teaching. The summative assessment is what happens after you've taught. So in a lesson plan, you can have both. You can have an objective where the child will recommend a fair solution to a peer conflict and justify their reasoning. Maybe you'll read a story, or you'll have scenario cards, right? You're going to be talking about, maybe you had a real issue in the classroom earlier that day, and you want to treat it as a teaching opportunity. So you can talk about it, listen to how the kids talk about conflict and resolution, and later that day, or if this is a multi-day lesson plan, then you can see, okay, did they really get everything that I was trying to convey about finding something that is equitable? So if a child knocked down another child's block tower, right, and the child was very upset, they worked really hard, and a child knocked it down, what would be a fair and reasonable solution to that? Perhaps apologize, perhaps help the child rebuild, right? Those are the kinds of things, not, put the child, in timeout for the rest of the school year, right? If a child is saying something like that, I'm like, maybe that's not really a fair solution. So we need to spend some more time talking about it. The last level is to create. So let's look at the creative arts here, specifically the visual arts. The child will design an original collage that represents their family using a variety of materials. So a formal assessment can just simply be something like the artist statement. So what did the child say, explaining their choices? Why did they choose these materials to make their family? Why did they choose this concept for their family? And a summative assessment is at the end. A teacher could say, well, did they use at least 3 materials? Did they represent their family? Were they able to explain at least one choice? And then how they do on this assessment is going to dictate what you're going to do in the future, right? It's going to guide your next lesson plan. So if you notice that the child is having difficulty staying on task, that they used 3 materials or more, they were able to explain something, but they didn't really make it about their family, they just made it about something else, right? We can talk why was there that disconnect happening? If they were not really able to explain something, if they were able to make something about their family, they used 3 or more materials, but they were limited in their explanation. Why? Is there are they lacking vocabulary, right? Then we can do some more oral family stories, reading books about families, more talking about families, to try to give them that that prior knowledge of the vocabulary that they'll need. So the alignment map, standard, objective, and assessment. So the backward design ensures that every piece connects. So we start with our standard, then we move to our learning objective. We think about our formal and formative assessment. We think if there's going to be a summative assessment that's appropriate in the lesson plan. And then we could think about any type of assessment questions that will tell us if our objective was met, right? So when you are thinking, gosh, what question should I ask? Go back to your objectives. What do you want them to be able to know at the end of this lesson? Ask questions that will help you gauge, are they picking up what you're putting down? So let's look at another example. We're looking at an application. So counting and cardinality. The child counts objects to find out how many there are. So that is a PA Early Learning Math standard. What could be an objective to help us determine if the child can count? So the child will use the counting on strategy, given 5 addition problems with manipulatives, to find sums within 10, and they're going to do this independently. So this is a very clear objective. I know the strategy they're going to use is counting on. I know they're going to be working on 5 addition problems and that they're going to have manipulatives to help them. And they're only going to be working up to sums of 10, and they're going to do this by themselves. So that is a very clear learning objective. So what about some formal assessments? The teacher observation checklist during the Math Center. I could record strategy. Are they counting on? Are they counting all? Are they subitizing? And subitizing is a math skill that you'll learn about if you take ECE 204, Science and Math. And are they correct or incorrect for each problem? At the end of the lesson, or at the end of the unit, I can give them 5 addition cards. The teacher scribes child's process on a 4-point rubric. Do they choose an appropriate strategy? Were they accurate? Were they able to explain their reasoning? And were they able to do it independently? And some assessment questions could be, show me how you got that answer. What number did you start counting from? Is there a faster way to figure that out? So all of those questions help me go back to answer my learning objective. So common mistakes and how to fix them. Again, just as a review, every pre-service teacher makes these mistakes, and every teacher will learn to catch them. So using non-observable verbs, writing one objective for an entire unit instead of one objective for each lesson. Choosing the same Bloom's level every time, and we teachers usually hang out at remember. Forgetting the condition, the child will count objects. What objects? How many? The assessment doesn't match the verb, and this happens a lot. You know, you want them to do something, but the way that you're going to assess them is completely different. Setting the degree too high or too low for the developmental stage. So those are some common mistakes, and here's how to fix them. So as you get working towards writing your own objectives, you can apply the formula ABCD to a PA Early Learning Standard that you're going to teach this semester. So this is really what you're going to be using for all of your lesson plans that you write at Luzerne County Community College. And here are some references if you would like some more information. So I hope that clears up and provides some guidance on why objective writing is so important and how to do it. You can rewatch this lecture or portions of this lecture as many times as you need. And happy lesson planning.